Welcome to Fluxpill. In 1965, a man stood before cameras and wept. He was not crying from joy. He was crying because his country had just been expelled from the federation it had worked for years to join, kicked out, separated, cast adrift as an independent nation against its own will, with no natural resources, no military, no hinterland, no fresh water of its own, and a population of less than 2 million people packed onto an island smaller than the city of Los Angeles. The man was Lee Kuan Yew. The country was Singapore. And in that moment of genuine public grief, almost nobody watching believed that what he was being asked to lead had any realistic chance of surviving as an independent nation. Today, 60 years later, Singapore has the third highest per capita income on Earth. Its port is one of the 2 or 3 busiest in the world. Its airport has been rated the best in the world more times than any other. Its public housing is so well designed that 80% of the population lives in government-built apartments and considers it a privilege. Its education system consistently ranks at or near the top of every international comparison. Its streets are among the cleanest and safest of any major city anywhere. And it has accomplished all of this on an island, with no oil, no minerals, no agricultural land, no rivers, and until recently, not even enough fresh water to supply its own population. Singapore is, by almost any reasonable measure, the most successful nation-building project of the 20th century. And the story of how it happened is one of the most instructive, most debated, and most consequential political and economic stories of the modern era. Let's start where Lee Kuan Yew started. With nothing. When Singapore became independent in August 1965, the situation was genuinely desperate in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of today's gleaming city-state. The British military, which had been the primary economic engine of the island, providing employment, spending money, and maintaining the port facilities, was in the process of withdrawing. Unemployment was running at around 13%. The population was ethnically divided among Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, with a history of communal violence, including race riots in 1964 that had killed people and traumatized the society. There was no clear economic basis for survival. No obvious answer to the question of what Singapore was going to sell to the world to pay for the food and water it couldn't grow or collect itself. Lee Kuan Yew and the small group of extraordinarily capable people around him, his deputy Keng Swee, his foreign minister S. Rajaratnam, his economic architect Han Swee Sen, sat down and thought about the problem with a clarity and a ruthlessness that was unusual for any government, let alone a brand new one. Their conclusion was stark. Singapore had one asset: its location. The island sat at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca, the narrow channel through which virtually all maritime trade between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean had to pass. The trade routes of half the world converged at Singapore's doorstep. If Singapore could make itself the most efficient, most reliable, most trustworthy place in that part of the world to do business, to store goods, to finance transactions, to process ships, to manufacture products for export, to connect buyers and sellers, the location alone could sustain an economy. The strategic insight was simple. The execution required something much harder than insight. It required the construction, almost from scratch, of an entire set of institutional conditions that most countries take generations to develop. The first and most fundamental decision Lee Kuan Yew's government made was about corruption. Singapore, in 1965, was not unusually corrupt by the standards of developing nations. But Lee and his colleagues understood something that most governments in similar situations did not, or understood but didn't act on. Corruption is not just morally wrong. It is economically fatal for a country trying to attract foreign investment. Every dollar that disappears in a bribe is a dollar that tells a foreign businessman that the rules here are not real, that contracts are not enforceable, that the system cannot be trusted. Singapore's Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, which had existed since the British era, was radically empowered. Its powers of investigation were expanded. Its political independence was reinforced. Crucially, and this is the element that actually made the difference, it was directed to investigate anyone, not just petty officials, not just the opposition, anyone, including ministers, including Lee Kuan Yew's own cabinet colleagues. Several of them were investigated. Some resigned. The message was unambiguous, and it was demonstrated through action rather than just stated in speeches. Simultaneously, civil service salaries were raised to levels competitive with the private sector. One of the most reliable drivers of petty corruption is a civil servant who cannot live on his government salary. Singapore decided to pay its civil servants well, demand performance from them, and hold them to a standard of conduct that was enforced rather than aspirational. The result, over time, was an institutional environment that businesses from around the world found genuinely remarkable. The rules were real. The contracts were enforceable. The permits were actually granted or denied on their merits. The customs officials did not expect payments. For a manufacturer or a bank or a trading company trying to operate in Southeast Asia, Singapore was a place you could actually trust. The second pillar of Singapore's transformation was industrialization, and the man most responsible for it was Keng Swee. Go understood that Singapore could not wait for organic private sector development to generate employment for a population that was growing and restless. The government would have to actively attract industry. It created the Economic Development Board, an institution with extraordinary powers to negotiate directly with foreign companies, offer them land, infrastructure, tax incentives, and a trained workforce in exchange for setting up manufacturing operations in Singapore. The targets were ambitious. Go wanted Singapore to attract the most sophisticated manufacturing possible, not the low-wage, low-skill assembly work that was the default for developing countries in the 1960s, but higher-value manufacturing that would transfer technology and build skills that Singapore could then use to move further up the value chain. Texas Instruments established operations in Singapore in 1968. Shell expanded its refinery. Other multinationals followed, attracted by the stability, the infrastructure, and the government's evident determination to make the business environment work. The workforce that these companies needed was built through deliberate education policy. Technical education was not treated as second-class education. The skills required to work in a semiconductor plant, or an oil refinery, or a ship repair facility were treated as genuinely valuable, and the institutions that taught them were funded and managed accordingly. Singapore made a conscious decision to produce the workforce that the industries it wanted to attract would need, rather than waiting to see what kind of workforce emerged, and then trying to attract industries that could use it. The third pillar was housing. And this is the element of Singapore's story that gets the least attention internationally, but may be the most socially consequential. When Lee Kuan Yew came to power, a large portion of Singapore's population lived in Kampung's traditional villages of wooden and atap houses, without running water or proper sanitation, packed around the central urban area. The Housing Development Board, established in 1960, was given the mandate to replace this with modern public housing on a scale and at a speed that was essentially unprecedented. By 1965, the HDB had already housed hundreds of thousands of people. By the 1980s, the vast majority of Singapore's population was living in HDB flats, government-built apartment blocks that were sold, not rented, to their occupants at subsidized prices, with financing provided through the Central Provident Fund, Singapore's mandatory savings scheme. The genius of the system was the ownership model. Singapore's public housing is not the stigmatized welfare housing of British council estates or American public housing projects. It is owned. The people living in it have equity in it. They can sell it in the open market. Its value has appreciated over time, along with Singapore's prosperity. The result is a society where 80% of the population lives in government-built housing and considers themselves property owners, a combination that has no real parallel anywhere else in the world. The government also used the HDB system to engineer ethnic integration. Quotas were established, requiring that each housing block contain a representative mix of Chinese, Malay, and Indian residents, preventing the formation of ethnic enclaves. This was social engineering in the most literal sense, and it was controversial, but it contributed to a degree of ethnic integration and day-to-day communal familiarity that has made Singapore's multiracial society more stable than many observers in 1965 would have thought possible. The fourth pillar was education. And here, Singapore's approach evolved over decades in a way that is worth following carefully. In the early years, the priority was basic literacy and technical skills. Get the population educated enough to work in the factories and port facilities that were generating employment. But as Singapore's economy developed and moved up the value chain, as the manufacturing became more sophisticated, as financial services grew, as Singapore positioned itself as a regional hub for everything from legal services to medical tourism to technology, the education system had to evolve with it. Singapore's school system today is internationally recognized for producing students with exceptional mathematical and scientific literacy. The methods are rigorous, the standards are high, and the results are consistent. But Singapore's educational planners have also spent the past 2 decades wrestling with the question of whether a system optimized for producing reliable high performers is also producing the creative thinkers and entrepreneurs that a knowledge economy eventually requires. It is a genuine tension. The same discipline and institutional strength that produced Singapore's economic miracle can, in an educational context, produce conformity rather than innovation. Singapore is aware of this and is actively trying to address it. More emphasis on project-based learning, more tolerance for unconventional thinking, more deliberate cultivation of an entrepreneurial culture. Whether it succeeds is one of the open questions about Singapore's next chapter. And there is a final dimension of Singapore's story that any honest account has to include. The political model that delivered all of these outcomes is not a liberal democracy in the Western sense. Kuan and the People's Action Party governed Singapore with a combination of genuine popular legitimacy. They delivered results, and Singaporeans knew it, and a degree of political control that regularly drew criticism from Western governments and human rights organizations. Opposition politicians were sued for defamation. The press operated within government-set boundaries. Civil liberties that Western democracies take for granted were constrained. Lee himself was unapologetic about this, arguing that the discipline and long-term planning that Singapore's development required were incompatible with the short-term political pressures of fully competitive multi-party democracy. This is the part of the Singapore story that creates the most disagreement among people who study it. Some argue that the political model was a necessary component of the economic success, that without the PAP's ability to make and implement long-term decisions, without being voted out for their short-term costs, Singapore's transformation could not have happened. Others argue that Singapore succeeded despite its political constraints, not because of them, that a more open political system might have produced the same economic outcomes without the civil liberty trade-offs. The argument will not be resolved here. What is inarguable is that Singapore looked at the hand it was dealt, a tiny island with no resources, no water, no hinterland, no military, a divided population, and no particular reason to believe it could survive as an independent nation. And it built something extraordinary. Not perfect, not without cost, not without choices that reasonable people can argue about, but extraordinary. A man wept in 1965 because he thought the task ahead was impossible. 60 years later, the city he built is proof that the most important resource any country has is not what lies beneath its ground or within its borders. It is the quality of the decisions its leaders make and the institutions those decisions build. Singapore decided well, and Singapore built well.